Look at how Mark frames the story. He frames it with the cursing of the fig tree. So Jesus comes up to the temple, but before he gets to the temple, he curses this fig tree. The fig tree stands for Israel, and that Israel has not got any fruit, and it should have fruit or something, and Jesus curses it. The temple is cleared, this incident, in Mark chapter 11, verse 15, thereabouts. And then the outcome, Jesus cleanses the temple. The outcome is the crowds are amazed. And in the book of Mark, you've got the crowds, you've got the amazement. Mark seems to be writing to a Roman audience, and so this fits perfectly. He cleanses the temple. The crowds are amazed, and the other people want to kill him. The religious leaders want to kill him. And so what you've got here is basically, this is the rejection of the prophet by the leaders of the country. And the leaders of the country reject it, and they seek to kill Jesus when he's framed. Then what happens? Okay, so he clears the temple. There's these two very different reactions. And then what happens? The fig tree withers. At the end, you come back in chapter 11, verse 20 in Mark. They go out again and they see that the fig tree is withered. So here it starts with the fig tree being cursed, and then the story ends with the fig tree withering. And you see Mark then frames kind of like an envelope, or as Dr. Phillips would say, an inclusio. An inclusio, it begins with the cursing of the fig tree, and then the fig tree withers. And that the fig tree then encapsulates, like bookends, encapsulates the story of the temple cleansing, largely to illustrate this point of the prophet's rejection. Jesus comes in as a prophet into the temple, and he is rejected. And they try to kill him and things. And so the tree withers because what? The tree represents Israel. That Israel's rejection of the message will result in the withering of the fig tree. So this is how Mark frames the story, as a prophetic rejection. Okay, prophetic rejection. So it's more in line with Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah chapter 7. So Mark frames it with this kind of quote, get these things out of my house, don't make my Father's house into a den of thieves kind of thing. Now let's look at the other one. Let's look at Matthew chapter 21. Now in Matthew, you remember, is about the kingdom of heaven. And so Matthew will portray this temple cleansing in the idea of a messianic restoration of the temple area. And so basically, let's look at the context and how it flows. Jesus in chapter 21, Matthew chapter 21, Jesus comes into the temple area. How does he get there? He's riding on a donkey. The people are all singing, Hosanna, Hosanna, to the King. And there's Palm Sunday. Matthew chapter 21, Palm Sunday, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, the Son of David coming in. Hosanna, Hosanna to the highest, okay? Then Jesus what? Jesus comes as the Messianic, as the Messiah. He comes into the temple and he cleanses the temple. That's the role of the Messiah, to make things right. And so he cleanses the temple, chapter 21, verse 12. In the book of Matthew, he flips over the tables and drives them out. And there's hosannas. The hosannas continue, and Jesus then, in the book of Matthew, Jesus flips over the table, he cleanses the temple, and then what should the Messiah do? The Messiah should heal people in the Temple Mount. So there's all these healings that Jesus does. And the Son of David, the people cry out, Son of David. And from the lips of children, you've ordained praise, Jesus says. And so what you have in the book of Matthew is Jesus flips over the table and the Messianic restoration. Jesus heals people, and he takes that which is broken and he fixes it, and he fixes people and stuff. The Messiah restores things to the way it should be. You get a glimpse of the kingdom that is not yet becoming already here when Jesus is here. Jesus is the king. He is the Messianic ruler, and so therefore he cleanses the temple and he heals people. He brings the kingdom to the now. The already but not yet, as Dr. Mathewson used to say so much, okay, the already but not yet. And so you get a glimpse of the not yet, but Jesus doing it already here as he heals these people and restores and cleanses the temple. So the Messianic restoration and the city's hosannas and things clearly seen here in the book of Matthew. The lame are healed. The outsiders are brought in. And this is the Messianic kingdom. You get a glimpse. In Matthew, you get a glimpse of the kingdom of heaven on earth. And Matthew portrays this in the temple cleansing. The insiders, however, the outsiders are brought in, but the insiders become opponents. And this is a minor role, though, here in things. And then the next day, the fig tree is withered. In other words, the fig tree is not the point here. He's showing the messianic restoration kind of thing. And so the fig tree is disconnected from the temple cleansing. And rather, the fig tree is used in Matthew as a lesson on prayer. The fig tree is used as a lesson on prayer in the book of Matthew. So Matthew uses the fig tree in conjunction with these things, but he uses it for a different function and shows Jesus' temple cleansing is actually the Messiah, a messianic restoration, especially featuring the healing of the people. Now, what do we have here in Luke? In Luke, it's interesting, in chapter 19, verse 45 and following, Luke's got the temple cleansing. And what does Jesus do? Jesus flips over the table, but then instead of healing people and making things in this messianic kingdom, giving you a glimpse of the kingdom, here you've got Jesus teaching in the temple. And so basically it's in the context of Jesus' lament for Jerusalem. Jesus comes over the Mount of Olives and he's going to go into the temple area. As he comes over the Mount of Olives, Jesus weeps and he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how many times as a mother hen I would have gathered you as chicks into my arms, but you would not." And he laments. You guys have seen in the Get Lost in Jerusalem program, the Dominus Flavit, the church where Jesus wept. The church itself is shaped like a tear, and it's on the Mount of Olives as you come down to Jerusalem across the Kidron Valley. And so the lament for Jerusalem, and this is foreshadowing. What is this a foreshadowing? The day of the Lord. This foreshadowing, the destruction of Jerusalem. God is coming to you. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The day of the Lord is coming. And basically, he mutes the incident. There's no reference to the money changers, the doves. There's no detail to, take the doves. The doves got special treatment, driving the people out. There's no reference to the money changers and things. He mutes the incident of the temple cleansing. Now, why does he mute the incident of the temple cleansing, the flipping over the tables and things like that? Instead of the flipping over the tables, the driving out the money tax collectors, and this kind of stuff, and the doves take special treatment with the doves and stuff, it's taken as an example of Jesus as the sage whose teaching function, and it's through Jesus' teaching function that the audience is split. So Jesus is the teacher in Luke. He's a messianic teacher. He's a sage teacher. It's very interesting to me, and this year is, I think, the first year I made this connection with it, with Luke. Luke is the only gospel. Do you remember when Jesus was 12 years old and they took him up to the temple for his bar mitzvah or whatever it was? And then they leave Jesus behind. This is kind of the first left behind series, okay? So Jesus is left behind, and his mother and father leave, and then all of a sudden they get it like 2 or 3 days out and say, "Hey, where's Jesus, man? Nobody knows where he is." Says, "Oh man, we lost him," and stuff. So they go back to Jerusalem. And they go what? They go into the temple area, and what's Jesus? Jesus is sitting there, what? Listening and teaching people in the temple area. And then his parents come up, "Hey, we were worried to death about you. What are you doing, man?" And Jesus says, "Hey, I should be about my Father's business," right? His Father's business in the temple. And so Luke starts in, I think it's Luke chapter 2 or 3 in there, he starts with Jesus as teacher in the temple. And then how does Luke end in chapter 19 here? He comes at the end of his book. He also comes back to Jesus now cleansing the temple and being the messianic teacher now as a 32-year-old person. So this is it's kind of a neat way that Luke, both at the when Jesus is 12 and then when Jesus just before his Passion Week, that he features this Jesus as sage, Jesus as wise teacher kind of thing, and that's Luke. So Luke tells the same story, the temple cleansing. He downplays certain of the details that are forefronted in the other Gospels, and instead Luke forefronts Jesus' teaching as sage. Okay. Now, I think we've lost our power here up front, but Matthew, let me just do John, and without the screen up, and just do John, and we'll just describe what happens in John. In John, Jesus comes and flips over all the tables and cleanses the temple. But at John puts the temple cleansing early. John puts the temple cleansing early. So it's almost in chapter 2 of John. This is how Jesus starts his ministry. But then Jesus says what? He flips over all the tables. What right do you do this? And Jesus says, destroy this temple. In 3 days, I'll raise it up. Well, what temple is he talking about? Jesus is flipping over the table and saying, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll lift it up, kind of thing. Okay? 3 days I'll lift it up. He's talking about the temple of his body. So in John, when Jesus flips over the tables, there's a transition from the temple cleansing to the temple of his body, and that in 3 days he'll raise it from the dead. By the way, is that issue that John raises, that in 3 days he'll raise it from the dead, is that a really important issue for the Jews? Yes, it is. Because do you remember on Jesus' trial when he comes before Caiaphas, there's some witnesses come forward and they said, on what basis should we accuse Jesus? On what basis should we accuse Jesus? Because he said he would destroy the temple and raise it up in 3 days. Did they not get it, that he was talking about the temple of his body? But then he raises from the dead the temple of his body 3 days later after resurrection. And so what you have in John then is John starts his gospel explaining to the Jews that he's not talking about the temple there. He's talking about the temple of his body. And when he raises from the dead, then his disciples put it together. Whoa, okay, that's what he was talking about. But they misunderstood. And so John is basically short-circuiting this Jewish misunderstanding of Jesus, that Jesus was going to destroy the temple. That's not the point. The point for the Jewish people, we realize the temple is the temple of his body. And so John puts that right initially. And so John puts Jesus' temple cleansing in the temple in that shift, that the temple that he's talking about is the temple of his body. So what you have then is in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Luke is the sage teacher. Mark is the prophetic rejection. Matthew is something on the kingdom, and Luke and John was the temple of his body. So they use the story of the temple cleansing is used in 4 different ways, according to the writer. And it's just absolutely beautiful how each writer crafts the story of the temple cleansing and puts it in a different context and gives it a different flavor and things and sees it from a different perspective. Even as, and let me just use one more example and we'll quit with this. How many refs do you have in a basketball game? How many refs do you have at a basketball game? Do you ever have just one ref? No, you don't have one ref. You have 2 or 3 refs because you need different perspectives. One ref may see, if somebody goes up and gets hit from one side, the other guy didn't see him and he whacked him with his hip and that's why the guy went flying and stuff. But the other guy from the different perspective, and if you've ever watched referees, you'll notice that they work different aspects of the court so that they can see different from a different perspective. And so what you've got is the gospel writers telling the same story, but they're like refs. They're looking from different perspectives. So as you need multiple refs in a basketball game. So you've got, 3 gospel writers. They see Christ with the same eye. They're telling many of the same stories and things. John's giving a very different story, but they're, even among the 3, they're using the story and they're seeing the story in a different light. So that's part of the synoptic problem, and next time we'll develop a little bit more of this further. Okay? Thanks. This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his New Testament History, Literature, and Theology course, lecture number 15, finishing up on prayer in the book of Luke in the Emmaus Road, and then proceeding into the synoptic problem.